In der Oper geht's pünktlich los. Hier auch so einigermaßen. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Im Namen der Zeitstiftung Bucerius, der Bucerius Law School und des Bucerius Kunstforums darf ich Sie herzlich begrüßen. Unser besonderer Gruß gilt den Mitgliedern des Konsularischen Korps und der Hamburger Bürgerschaft. Und er gilt Timothy Snyder, der die heutige Bucerius Lecture unter das Thema The Future of Freedom gestellt hat. Das Thema Freiheit hat seit Beginn unserer Arbeit vor mehr als 50 Jahren zu unseren Kernthemen gehört. Unser Stifter, Gerd Bucerius, ist einmal als Fanatiker der Freiheit bezeichnet worden. Unvergessene Mitstreiterinnen und Mitstreiter haben sich ihm zur Seite gestellt. Ich darf an Marion Gräfin Dönhoff oder Ralf Dahrendorf erinnern, aber auch an Helmut Schmidt, der ja nicht nur eine kleine Statue des Marc Aurel auf seinen Arbeitstisch platziert hatte, sondern sich auch immer wieder mit den Kernfragen der Kantschen Ethik beschäftigt hat. Es würde zu weit führen, all die Projekte aufzuführen, in denen wir uns mit dem Thema Freiheit auseinandergesetzt haben und weiterhin auseinandersetzen werden. Wir begrüßen unsere Projektpartner bei einem dieser Projekte, die ihre Arbeit im Anschluss an die Lecture unten vorstellen. Es ist aber, meine Damen und Herren, mehr als nur symbolisch, dass der Platz vor unserem Hause nach Anna Politkowskaja benannt worden ist. In seinem so wichtigen Buch On Freedom über Freiheit schreibt Timothy Snyder, ich zitiere, die Freiheit ist der Wert der Werte, denn sie ist die Bedingung, unter der alle anderen Werte ausgeübt werden können. Ganz so sehen wir das auch, wobei ich mir sicher bin, dass auch unser Gast Freiheit und Achtung der Menschenwürde in einem unauflöslichen Zusammenhang sieht. Damit bin ich bei der Hauptperson des heutigen Abends angelangt. Lieber Herr Snyder, wir freuen uns ungemein, Sie heute Abend bei uns zu Gast zu haben. Vielen Dank für Ihr Kommen. Und noch speziellen Dank für, dass Sie dies trotz einer ausgeprägten Erkältung tun, aber das sehen wir gut durch. Der Professor für Geschichte an der Yale University und Permanent Fellow am Wiener Institut für die Wissenschaft vor Menschen hat uns und viele Tausende in aller Welt spätestens mit seinem Buch On Tyranny zu seinen Studenten gemacht. Und das wird auch mit seinen Gedanken zur Zukunft der Freiheit wieder so sein. Genügend Anknüpfungspunkte hält ja bereits die Gegenwart für uns bereit. Es ist, meine Damen und Herren, eine Binsenweisheit, die Zukunft der offenen, liberalen, freien Gesellschaft ist in Gefahr. Das Vordringen der Autokraten beiderlei Geschlechts und unterschiedlicher Färbung ist ebenso wenig zu übersehen wie die Knebelung von Grundrechten in so vielen Ländern. Ich möchte aber noch auf eine andere Gefährdung hinweisen. Neulich gab es im Fernsehen ein Gespräch darüber, ob eins dieser sogenannten sozialen Medien, ich glaube, es drehte sich um X, nicht notfalls abgeschaltet werden sollte. Kommentar einer jungen Dame: Auf keinen Fall, dann hätte ich ja viel zu viel Zeit. Auf keinen Fall, dann hätte ich ja viel zu viel Zeit. Die hier sichtbar werdende Bereitschaft zur Selbstverblödung ist beileibe kein Einzelfall. Die hier drohende Gefahr ist ungemein und sie ist unmittelbare Realität. Hier kommt uns wieder Timothy Snyder zu Hilfe, wenn er schreibt, unser Problem ist nicht die Welt, unser Problem sind wir. Und deshalb können wir es lösen. Wir können frei sein, wenn wir erkennen, was Freiheit ist. In der Tat, kritische Distanz und auch mancher Zorn, die sind wohl uns erlaubt. Innere Emigration aber ist es nicht. Meine Damen und Herren, anschließend werden Johanna Elisabeth Buffler am Klavier und Jubini am Cello Musik von Astor Piazzolla zu Gehör bringen. Beide jungen Künstlerinnen sind Stipendiaten der Deutschen Stiftung Musikleben, die wir auch seit beinahe 25 Jahren fördern. Frau Buffler zudem mit dem Bucerius-Stipendium. Und nun wünsche ich uns einen ertragreichen Abend. Vielen Dank.
Jürgen Lee und Johanna Isir-Pufler, vielen herzlichen Dank für diese Klänge, diese Einstimmung auf diesen Abend. Das war wirklich wunderschön. Und nun freue ich mich sehr auf die erste Hamburger Bucerius Lecture, gehalten von Timothy Snyder. Es wird sich ein Gespräch zwischen ihm und mir noch anschließen und dann natürlich auch die Möglichkeit geben, für Ihre Fragen Sie zu stellen. But now, please join me in welcoming Timothy Snyder for the first Hamburg Bucerius Lecture.
Es freut mich immer, ein paar Wörter von meinem Buch auf Deutsch zu hören. Unter anderem, weil ich nicht die Chance bis jetzt gehabt habe, es auf Deutsch zu lesen. Und es war alles gut. So we will, what we'll be trying to do in the next half an hour or so is to try to fill the idea of freedom with content. I appreciate the kind introduction and the reference to traditions of freedom, including those associated with teachers of mine. What I'd like to do in this lecture is to suggest that the solution to some of the political problems facing us, may have to do with an incomplete understanding of freedom. And I'd like to argue that whatever the political consequences of this might be, it's very much worthwhile to try to understand the notion of freedom as the value of values. In a time when it's a bit unfashionable to imagine that values and politics are connected, and also at a time when the idea of values, or to be even more old-fashioned, virtue, is seized by people who in practice seem to have no values or virtues at all. So I'd like to begin with that very broad claim that insofar as we want to live in an open society, or insofar as we wish to call our political system democratic, we're going to have a lively and complete, and I even think correct notion of freedom. What I'm trying to say is, I don't think freedom is an idea that stands apart from other ideas or stands apart from practice. What I'm trying to say is that freedom connects to everything that matters to us, and that we need to see those connections. And when I say everything, I mean everything. So for example, 2 days ago, I was in Stockholm, where I was taking part in the official Swedish commemoration of the Holocaust. And the next day in Oslo, I was thinking about that, and I've been thinking about it as I've watched events unfold in the US and also in Germany these last 2 days. And I'd like to begin by proposing that even Auschwitz, even the Holocaust, or perhaps especially Auschwitz, especially the Holocaust, we should be thinking about in terms of freedom. Or, let me make an even stronger claim, that when we do talk about freedom in connection with Auschwitz or the Holocaust, we actually reveal how incomplete our understanding of the word might be. What do I have in mind? I have in mind the notion of the liberation of the concentration camps. We commemorate the Holocaust on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. But those camps, I think in a proper sense of freedom, were never really liberated. It's not really possible to liberate a concentration camp. And when I say that, I'm not making some bold statement 80 years after. I'm repeating the kinds of things which people actually said in the time and the place. When we say that we've liberated a concentration camp, it gives us a great sense of satisfaction. We imagine that in removing the evil, we've done everything that needs to be done. And what I want to suggest that feeling, satisfying though it might be, leads us into a completely false understanding of what freedom actually is. And I believe the Holocaust, or the concentration camps, as an extreme example, can help us to get started to see what I mean. So when doctors and nurses arrived after the soldiers, what did they say? Did they say, this has been a liberation? On the contrary, they said, these people are horribly sick. They're starving. They need food. They're physically and mentally traumatized. That's what one would say naturally the day after, or 2 days after, or 3 days after. In my work within something called the Fortunoff Archive for Holocaust video testimonies at Yale, I've watched hundreds of testimonies of Holocaust survivors, and one can't help be struck how even decades later that the trauma, the physical trauma, certainly also the mental trauma, is still very present. So at what point were those people liberated? At what point exactly did they become free? This might seem like an extreme example, but I think we need these extreme examples to see common sense. I think our everyday lives actually tend to drive us away from common sense, and it's the extremes that can help us to see what a notion like freedom actually means. Let me try to bring it a little bit closer. When Central Europeans, when Germans commemorate the Holocaust, I think, of course, not only of the very specific policy of mass murder and elimination, directed against the Jews, I also think of the war that made it possible and the territory that that war was chiefly about, which is, of course, Ukraine. We have a war taking place in Europe right now, which is very much about freedom, and in which the scale of the losses is becoming comparable to that of a world war. And indeed, in many ways, I think the war in Ukraine is a world war in which only one country is fighting on the correct side. But inside this war, on the territories that have been recovered by the Ukrainian army, we can also draw examples that show what I'm trying to say about the meaning of freedom, namely that freedom is positive, that freedom isn't just the removal of an evil, no matter how great that evil might be, but it must also involve the restoration of the good, the assertion of values. So for the last 3 years, I've been visiting territories in Ukraine that have been deoccupied by the Ukrainian army. That's a useful Ukrainian word, deokupovanne, deokupacja. It's a useful Ukrainian word because deoccupation is not the same thing as liberation. If you say deoccupation, you're leaving room for what liberation might also be. So in September, for example, I was in Kharkiv, which is a city, as you'll know, close to the border with Russia. Takes less than a minute for missiles to reach there. The Russian army in 2022 actually crossed into the city, and that part of the city was deoccupied, right? It was deoccupied. Is it liberated? Well, maybe not completely, because people are still afraid of bombs and glider bombs and missiles. But insofar as people can get out of their houses and go to the theater and things like this, perhaps you could say it's liberated, but it's not the same thing. A year before that, I was in Kherson Oblast, in a little village called Posad Pokrovska, where every single house had been destroyed, every single house. So just imagine a town, any town in Germany, just imagine every single house being destroyed. Every single house was destroyed, and I happened to visit with an older lady called Maria, who flinched when planes flew overhead, understandably. And she was living in a corrugated metal shack behind the ruins of her house. And this house was, of course, the ruins of this house, we might say it had been liberated, that the town had been liberated. But it struck me when I looked at her walker and when I looked at her handicap that she wouldn't be free until the rubble was removed and until she could walk to the street and until there was a bus there at the street that could take her to the grocery store. Freedom isn't just the removal of the good, the removal of the evil. Even if the evil is the destruction of a village, freedom also has to be the presence of the good. A year before that, I was in Yahidne in north-central Ukraine, which was a very special example of horror, where the Russian occupiers kept the entire population of the town in the basement of the school for a month without providing sufficient food or water. They killed more than 10 people, and more than 10 people also died of exhaustion or illness while they were held underground in what amounted to a concentration camp. When the Russians were driven out of the town, we might say those people were liberated, but the children no longer have a school. And when I left Yahidne, the gentleman who had lent me the keys so I could go and look at the basement of the school asked for help building a playground. And that might seem like a trivial thing. Why would people in the middle of a war be talking about a playground? Shouldn't they be concerned with more dramatic things? But of course, a playground has everything to do with freedom. The fact that the Russians were gone didn't mean that people were free. They were traumatized. They needed help in various kinds of ways, but among other things, they were thinking, how are our children going to spend the day? How are our children going to grow up? I give these examples because I think the basic philosophical point I'm trying to make is one that is deeply grounded in the reality of how we actually live our lives and lose our lives. Whereas too often the way that people talk about freedom today is very abstract. I'm going to now give you a philosophical definition of freedom, but I think it's one that actually captures something about the way we live, as opposed to drawing us away from it. The way I see freedom, as was kindly said in the introduction, is as the value of values. Freedom is the value we should be most concerned with, not because it's better than all other things. I'm not in a contest for which things are more important, but because it is the condition in which all other good things are possible. What does that mean? Well, this way of thinking about freedom philosophically has three parts. The first is moral realism. So some things are good. I'm making a radical conservative claim, so I'm expecting outrage from the audience. Some things are good. Integrity is good, honesty is good, loyalty is good, beauty is good. Some things are good, and the virtues are just as real as the objects. They're not real in the same way, but they're just as real. So moral realism is part of it. The second part of it, which I've already suggested, is pluralism. So there isn't one good thing. If there were one good thing, we could all be totalitarians, but there is no one good thing. There are many good things, and those many good things do not fit together. So for example, you would probably all think, okay, I'll take a German example. We would probably all think that punctuality is good. Right? When the trains aren't on time, we complain, right? So punctuality is good. But many of us would probably also think that spontaneity is good. Not for trains particularly, right? But spontaneity and punctuality obviously don't work together, right? Most of us would think consistency is good. Most of us would probably also think that mercy is good, but mercy is by definition inconsistent. Mercy always involves making an exception, and so on and so forth, right? And so on and so forth. Loyalty and honesty, right? If you say, after this lecture, if you say, Professor Snyder, despite your cold, I could understand every word you said. Loyalty or honesty, right? Or some mixture, who knows? But this is the point. Freedom is the condition in which we make the decisions about which values we're going to affirm. And that's moral pluralism. And I've already suggested the third part, which is a kind of moral arithmetic or moral geometry. I think the things that are good, the virtues, are real the same way that objects are real, but they don't follow the same laws of physics, or they don't follow the same laws of mathematics. I can say that the piano is bigger than the chair, but I can't say that loyalty is bigger than honesty. They're simply both good things, and human beings have to make inherently subjective judgments about which one is better or which one to apply in a given situation. There's no escape from that. There's no way to avoid the human subjectivity involved in making those choices. The good things don't all fit together like a puzzle. We have to make decisions, and the decisions are inherently subjective. But as we make those decisions, as we affirm certain values over time, we become the people that we are. And this leads me to the second part of the definition. So the first part was philosophical. The second part is corporeal. It has to do with the body, with how we actually live our lives. I think there was a beautiful point was made by Simone Weil, who's one of the philosophers that I rely on in the book. And she said, more or less, it takes Simone Weil a while to say things, but she said more or less that we are only free to do the things we know how to do, which seems to me to be a very fundamental point worth remembering, and certainly applicable to the question of spending all of our time in front of Twitter, or as I suspect, TikTok, in the anecdote that you gave. We are only free to do the things we know how to do. If we are raised or educated in such a way that we can't do anything, we are less free, right? I am happy to concede that I am less free because I cannot play the piano like this, right? It's the things we know how to do make us free. And the things that we know how to do all have something to do with our body. The second way that freedom has to do with our body is that freedom has to be based on the kinds of creatures we are. So It seems like a very simple point to make, but it matters a lot that we were all born. And it matters a lot that we are all going to die. And it matters a lot that these are things that we have in common with one another as humans. These things are not true of the machines. They're not true of the algorithms, but they are true of us. And if we take them seriously, they lead us to a much more realistic idea of freedom. What do I mean by that? I mean that very often, at least in the Anglo-Saxon tradition of talking about freedom, the body doesn't come into play at all. We imagine that a kind of abstract being who has property and is already possessed of rationality and is confronting some kind of choice. But how did that being come into existence? Who raised that child? I'm talking about children especially, because I actually have an audience here which includes people who are under 5. And a lot of my argument actually depends on people who are under 5 years old. So thank you for being here. I appreciate your patience. It doesn't happen every time, so it's great. It helps the average age a lot when people under 5 come. So very often the notion, when we describe freedom in a philosophical way, we're starting from an abstraction, right? A person is facing a choice. But how did that person become that person, and how did they gain the capacities to make those choices? And then, of course, there's also another critique to make about this. Very often, when we imagine that person who is rational and has property and so on, we are implicitly imagining a man, and I will push this further. We're implicitly imagining a man who has behind him slaves and women who have created the conditions in which he can stand alone and be free. A whole lot of our thinking about freedom, especially what I'm calling negative freedom, depends upon that. It depends upon pushing into the background the conditions that allowed one person to be free. Whereas what we need to be able to do is to recognize that we're all in equal predicaments and that we all have an equal right to be free. The third part of the body and freedom has to do with empathy. So when we say empathy, usually we mean let's be nice to each other. But that's not what empathy actually is. Empathy runs much deeper than that. And here you can kind of sense where I'm going when you imagine, okay, what are the great thinkers of negative freedom, or the important politicians of negative freedom, people like Donald Trump or Elon Musk? What do they think about empathy? How empathetic are they, right? And I leave that question with you. I'm trusting you can answer it yourselves. And here we see the depth of the issue, I think. Everybody who talks about freedom assumes that we have to be rational, or I prefer the word reasonable, that we have to know ourselves. But how can we know ourselves? You cannot know yourself by yourself. That is literally impossible. We all walk through life with a huge bit of metaphysical spinach stuck between our front teeth, and we don't recognize it without the help of other people. We cannot know who we are unless we're able to listen to other people, and we will not listen to other people unless we empathize with them in the fundamental sense that Edith Stein had in mind in her dissertation, in a bodily sense. We have to recognize that other people are living lives that are fundamentally similar to ours, that we're all trapped in bodies in the same ways, that we have similar limitations. If we can do that, this is the trick, then we have a chance of knowing ourselves. And if we know ourselves, then we have a chance to be free. Now, if we think about freedom this way, positively as philosophy, and positively corporeally, then it becomes positive politically, which is where I'm going to end. So when I say positive philosophically, I mean values are real. We go through life affirming them. When we're free, we can affirm them over time and become characters, moral agents. When I say positive corporeally, I mean I'm affirming us as human beings. I'm on our side against the machines. And that, by the way, is the only us and them that is meaningful in the world. The machines will instruct you that there are many other us and thems, you might have noticed. but the only us and them that really matters is us and the machine. And so with that, you can see how freedom can be positive politically. If freedom is a matter of being agents who can make choices among values, how do we become such people? And if we are mortal and we live over time and we're limited, how do we become such people? And the answer is, we can only do it together. And here I'm trying to address what I take to be the basic tension within freedom and solve it. Freedom is about individuals, and in this sense, I'm an individualist. I would like to see all of us to be beautifully eccentric, unpredictable, lovely individuals. But the only way to have such individuals is for us to work together collectively, politically, and generationally. No one can become an individual by himself. No one can become an individual by himself. And once we recognize that, then we have a chance of moving towards positive freedom. So the political implications of this are pretty simple, as I see it. There is a justification for government. The libertarians are wrong. The justification for government is precisely to allow people to be free. The things that we need in order for people to be free, like, for example, childcare, early childhood education, parental leave, vacations, these sorts of things can't be done by the baby. A baby can only grow up to be free if these conditions are already present as a result of collective generational work. And here we see a kind of difference between, in my country, the right and the left, but more broadly, North America, perhaps, or the United States and Europe. A lot of the things that are necessary to have positive freedom are in fact policy in places like Germany, but they're rarely defended in the name of freedom. And I think that's the most fundamental defense that you have for them. I think that the main argument for the social welfare state is actually freedom. And that if one accepts that, I think one is not only making a true statement, one is also making an important political intervention. Because what's happened, of course, in this country to some extent, and in the world at large quite a lot, is that the word freedom has been co-opted by people who see freedom only negatively. And if you see freedom only negatively, you end up destroying the value. How does that happen? Well, morally and politically. Morally, if freedom is only negative, if it's only me against the world or me against the government, then I've never answered the question of who I am. And I can't possibly be free. I'm irresponsible. Politically, if freedom is just me against the government, then I'm going to make a very small government. It's going to be dysfunctional. Bad things will happen. I don't know if you've been reading the news in the United States, but there will be more things like that as we make our government more dysfunctional. And those bad things will leave people less free, dead, sick, but also less free. And if I make government very small on purpose, that doesn't clear the space for freedom. It clears the space for oligarchs who will come in, fill in that space, and make matters much worse for everybody. So morally and politically, negative freedom can't work, but that's what freedom means in everyday language, at least a lot of the time, just negative freedom. Whereas positive freedom actually solves the problem, and it solves a lot of problems. It solves the problem of freedom in government. It justifies government, but also limits government. It takes a lot of political work to make free people, but that doesn't justify everything a government might do. It solves, I think, in a pretty fundamental way, the problem of an individual in society. We're taught to think there's this tremendous clash between the individual and society. I no longer believe that. I think the answer would be that if freedom is the highest value, we want to create individuals, but you can only create individuals as a society. Another huge tension we're supposed to believe in is that between freedom and security. I no longer believe in that either. As the president of Ukraine once said to me, and I think completely rightly, when we deoccupy a village, we bring both freedom and security. And that is generally true almost all of the time. If you bring security, you're also bringing freedom. And if you bring freedom, you're also bringing security. And maybe most importantly, and this is the note I'll end on, and then we can begin our conversation, it resolves, I think, a terrific problem that we have between the present and the future. If you believe that freedom is only negative, you're stuck forever in the present. You're stuck forever in a horizontal struggle between you and the government. And then, by the way, it's a very small step between that struggle between you and the government to a struggle between you and your neighbors, you and people who think differently, you and the migrants. That's where negative freedom takes you. It's a very small step from there to freedom being a struggle against you, between you and the facts, you and the truth, because you conceive of them as just more limitations on yourself. And before you know it, when you're making the government dysfunctional, attacking your neighbors, and resisting the idea of truth, you become a fascist. And that is how the libertarian to fascist transmission belt actually works. And in that kind of politics, as you might have noticed, there is no future. There is simply a permanent us and them, and a permanent set of spectacles, a permanent set of arguments for you to be angry at or fear the people around you. Whereas if you think of freedom positively, you have a program for the future. As an individual, you know, I believe in good things. I can become a moral character as I pursue them. And as a political system, you can say, there are always more things that we can do to create the conditions for people to be free. Thank you very much.
Timothy Snyder. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Timothy Snyder, for that compelling lecture, shaping a kind of conceptual basis for a couple of issues many of us in the room are actually working on. So what I would like to try in the next, let's say, 20 minutes, to touch upon a couple of issues and try to argue how to, or discuss how to put that ideas basically into practice. Afterwards, I'd love to open up the floor for questions from you. And wie Sie gemerkt haben, spricht Timothy Snyder wunderbar Deutsch. Sie können auch die Fragen auf Deutsch stellen und versucht sie auf Englisch zu beantworten. I'm very much looking forward to that discussion. So, you are a person who inspired millions around the world. There's even a rock song and an opera inspired by some of your writings. And in this room, there are many people who try to work on a positive notion of freedom. So in the final part of your lecture, you made the truly important distinction between the negative notion of freedom and the positive one. And in this room, I think there are educators, journalists, scientists who really try to work hard on that positive notion of freedom. Mm-hmm. However, the AFDers or the COVID deniers or some other people, they utterly try to push the narrative, the negative narrative of freedom. How can we, practically, win back or reclaim the notion of freedom for us? What's your advice?
Okay, well, that's a big question, and I won't dodge it by saying that's what the last chapter of the book is about, but I will say that that's what the last chapter of the book is about, and it's an important question because, in my own mind, the definition of freedom must be correct, but it must also recommend better ways of understanding problems in the world, and I think it does. The way you ask the question is quite fundamental, so I'm going to try to answer it in a fundamental way too. Positive freedom is about human beings, and that may seem like a very modest way to start, but it's actually already a very big claim inside the current discussion of freedom, because much of what passes for arguments about freedom do not in fact concern human beings. let me give the example of free speech. So, yeah, in English, this doesn't really work as well in German, but in English, we say free speech. And I think that's really a misnomer. I don't think speech is free or can be free. I think human beings can be free to speak, and that is not a pedantic distinction, but an incredibly important one. If you start talking about free speech, you very quickly find yourself in the position of defending Elon Musk's algorithms. And you very quickly find yourself saying, well, it's very important that someone with $300 billion be able to reach 500 million people instead of 400 million people, which is what the American free speech debate is pretty much about. It's the focal points are generally extraordinarily wealthy and powerful people who believe that in some way the government is preventing them from exercising total hegemony. And that's where you get pretty quickly if you think about free speech, if you think about speech, the utterance as the thing that needs to be protected. The vast majority of utterances now, 99.99999%, are not a result of direct human communication. They're a result of algorithmic generation, or at least algorithmic targeting. And I don't think the code has the same, should be protected the way that a human should be protected. I think it's a very different kind of situation. And it becomes obvious how it's different if you think about freedom positively in the corporeal sense I was talking about. Why do we have freedom of speech? Why is freedom of speech, as Americans say, a thing? Freedom of speech it exists in our tradition because it's dangerous, physically dangerous, for weaker people to speak the truth to stronger people. That's why we have it. You have freedom of speech so that if someone who's less powerful says the truth about someone who's more powerful, the person who's less powerful won't be harmed. But we only remember that if we think about the body and the possibility of physical danger, right? If we think about it abstractly in terms of utterances, we lose the entire tradition of discussing freedom of speech as we've had it at least since Euripides. So it's about the body. Freedom of speech is about the body, and freedom of speech acknowledges differences in power. In fact, it's precisely there to defend the weaker against the stronger. If we think about it negatively, we end up with, I must be on the side of Elon Musk, which is where the United States Supreme Court ends up with its way of seeing freedom as negative and its libertarianism. So I'm just answering. You can keep pressing me, but one way to do this, one place to start in our world, is to make sure you're starting all discussions of freedom with the human being and with the human body, because most of it now is not about human beings and human bodies, and that leads us off to these places where, in fact, we end up defending the rights of machines who don't care and can't care, and in fact are taking our lives away from us and making us less free.
In your book, one of the most dystopian parts actually are those parts where you're dealing with social media and algorithms. So it's even more probably dystopian as many of the people around in that audience who are in journalism or deal or report on journalism are actually seeing that. Can you elaborate on your view a little? Why is it that you see that so radically changing around the world?
Well, this gives me a chance to say a word about unpredictability. So in the book, in the way I structure the book, I have the philosophical argument about freedom first, and then the political recommendations at the end. And then in the middle, there are sections that I didn't have time to present to you today, but which I call the forms of freedom, which are the various ways that over a human life, thinking about freedom meets acting about freedom. And they're set up, the order of them is sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, factuality, and solidarity. So unpredictability for me is one of the forms of freedom. And again, here I'm starting with the person. Okay? And I think this is really important to start from what we are and what's special about us. I don't want to start with an outdated classical version of physics, which says we are predictable objects like other predictable objects, right? That we're just Körper. This is why I borrow from Edith Stein the distinction she uses between Körper and Leib. There's something very special about us. This is why she calls us Leibe rather than Körper, because of course we're physical objects. If you drop us, we will fall, but we're not just physical objects. We are aware of our own position. We're aware of the limits of our own position. We can work in a world of values, again, her term, which is different from the world of things, and our world of values can change the world of things. So if I think a certain kind of music is beautiful, then I have two musicians begin a performance, and I've changed the world of things, but because of values, right? And this is what's special about us. What's special about us is that, in my view, we're unpredictable. So I am putting unpredictability at the heart of discussions of freedom, and in this I'm challenging, actually Daniel Markovits was the first to point this out to me. I'm challenging the tradition that comes from Kant of thinking of rationality as being the heart of freedom. I don't believe that. I believe that what is special about us is unpredictability, and the unpredictability comes from the world of values, for the reason I tried to explain before. If I'm just a body, then of course, a body, a Körper, then I'm predictable. And if that's true, then freedom really is just about barriers. It's just the barrier is I'm bumping up against a barrier. But if I'm a human being, I might be able to evaluate what's a barrier and what's not a barrier. A wall sometimes holds up a roof, and that can be a good thing. And whether something in my hand is a weapon or a tool depends a great deal on how I'm evaluating it. Right? So as a human, I have the power to evaluate, but what's wonderful and almost magical about this is that the values don't fit together in any predictable way. So as we make judgments about values, we become unpredictable in a way that the world is not, and in a way that the machines are not, and the algorithms are not. So I'm trying to start every answer with us, because what's wrong with the machines is what they do to us. And we can go into this in more detail if people are interested, but the algorithms are fundamentally designed according to mid-20th century behaviorist laboratory studies on rats and pigeons, which determined how to make certain kinds of animals, and we are among them, more predictable. They're designed to give you a pattern of pleasure, 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 fear, pleasure, fear, an unpredictable mix of pleasure and fear, which will keep you online looking at advertisements. And how you react to the stimuli provides information to the machine, which allows it to even better anticipate what you'll find pleasurable and what you will fear. And as this process takes place, you yourself become simpler. Your specificities are eroded. You become less interesting. In a sense, you become part of the machine. You just become one more input. You're reduced to this binary of pleasure and fear. And so that's one of the basic arguments here, that if you start all of this by thinking about what's special about us, then you see what it costs us to spend so much time in front of a set of stimuli which are designed to make us more predictable than we would be otherwise.
Well, then let's dive deeper into another form of freedom you mentioned in your book. So the fourth of the five forms of freedom is factuality, adhering to fact, getting a grip of the world. What would be the role of journalism in that changing world as you see it at the moment?
Yeah, wonderful. So, no, I mean wonderful. A couple of books ago was Der Weg in die Unfreiheit, The Road to Unfreedom, which I dedicated to journalists as the heroes of our time, which I meant completely sincerely. I believe that journalists are the heroes of our time. And the reason I say this is because the economic and also the sort of sociological forces are now directed against journalists. There's the problem of people not believing in truth. There's the problem of people being taught to distrust journalists precisely by the wealthy people who don't want to be monitored by journalists. There's the problem of decreasing advertising revenue, which makes it hard to run a newspaper. And the result of this, more in the US than in Germany, but the trend is the same, unfortunately. The result is that it's harder and harder to have a decent life as a journalist. And again, starting from what we need. What do we need? In order to be free, we need facts. So now I'm going to do another one of my, I'm going to say another crazy conservative thing, so watch out. Some things are true. And some things are not true. Although we may never be able to perfectly define what truth is, it's a horizon towards which we move by way of investigation and self-criticism. And so the first thing you have to do actually is accept that. And that, I mean, I say this naive thing in public a lot, that some things are true and some aren't, because without that, you can't actually go anywhere. If it's all just a matter of opinion, it's really hard to justify journalism, just like it's really hard to justify science, modernity, a lot of things. So you have to kind of make that first claim. And then the second thing you have to do is you have to recognize that facts are human events, by which I don't mean, again, that they're just a matter of what's inside your head, but that it takes a lot of work to discover facts. It takes human agency and human labor and some kind of human method, like a laboratory experiment or an investigative piece of journalism. And so facts are human, they're only discovered by humans. And again, that seems like a simple thing, but the whole world is telling you it's not. The whole world is telling you that the internet brings you facts, but it doesn't. It doesn't. We're living in a world of ever fewer facts, spread ever more thinly. People know less about themselves, about their immediate environments. They have less access to the most important facts about themselves and their lives than they did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. People are, in fact, much less well-informed, Germans, Americans, everybody, than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. IQs are going down, to say another taboo thing, right? We're becoming less intelligent all the time. And the danger is, of course, we've become so unintelligent that if I say something like that, we all go, wait a minute. That can't apply to me. Mm-hmm. Okay. So facts take organized human labor. And then, so there's truth, facts take organized human labor. It has to be organized, right? So there has to be support for laboratories and journalists. It doesn't happen automatically. And the facts take labor part, I need to stress that, because what the negative freedom people pretty much always say is, they say things like free market of ideas. And the notion of free market of ideas is that the good ideas rise to the top. Okay. That argument is completely self-destructive, because that argument has risen to the top, and it's obviously ridiculous. Right? The best ideas do not rise to the top. That's simply not true. The ideas that are backed by wealth and money and repetition rise to the top. The free market of ideas is a very comforting notion, because it suggests we don't really have to do anything, and the good ideas will somehow reach us by way of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or whatever. Like, it will. No, that was not a criticism of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which I read regularly and admire because it has actual journalism. But the notion that there's some mechanism by which the facts automatically reach us is very comforting and completely untrue and self-destructive, self-contradictory, but also self-destructive. You have to think, how are we going to generate the facts? How are we going to create the facts? Because if you don't, you end up having less of them. And then we need the facts politically. We need them because to be a democracy, you have to be able to cooperate with other people. Mm. And as I've been stressing, we have different values, and that's good. But if we also have different facts, then we can't cooperate. Yeah. If we have different values in the same facts, we'll find areas to cooperate. And then the fundamental reason we need facts, so there's the positive reason we need facts so we can cooperate. By the way, you can't have the rule of law without facts either, because you have to have findings of facts.
That's what we try to teach here at that law school, yeah?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But then in the final analysis, or in the most extreme situation, you need facts to resist a tyrant. the facts are the final thing that you have. If you have nothing less, you can at least make a factual claim. If you have nothing less, you can at least say, Elon Musk has $400 billion, right? You can at least say it. That's your last resort. But if there's no truth, maybe Elon Musk only has $30. Who knows, right? In the final analysis, the last stand that you make is going to be based on facts. And if there are no facts, if they don't exist or if we don't believe them, then you find yourself on a completely frictionless, slippery surface, and you can never make that final stand.
Yeah. So maybe let's try to see what actually we could do in order to work for a better understanding of freedom and for a better society. So in your book, you have this arch from the philosophical to the very current political issues. So maybe let's look at the last 10 days events there. So if I was watching Donald Trump's inauguration, as probably you did as well, and you saw those preacher, Lorenzo Savelle, who always was telling, "Let freedom ring." This was his big claim. So how depressed are you if you look at the current events in the US?
I'm not depressed. We're not allowed to be depressed. I'm not depressed. Depression is a stage in authoritarianism, and it's normal to be upset or to be dismayed. It's normal to have negative feelings and so on, but depression is a stage in the development of authoritarianism. Essentially, they want you to be depressed. They want you to feel powerless, and I don't feel that way. And there are plenty of people in America who have many better reasons than me to feel depressed or powerless. But in general, like the sense that you can't do anything, the sense of powerlessness is what they aim for. And of course, things are much worse in the US now than they were, 10 days ago. And they will keep getting worse for some time. The next 6 months, I think, are going to be quite dramatic. But that doesn't mean there's nothing that one can do. And it doesn't mean that one, so this is the reason why I wrote the book. Yeah. I really think that you can't, this is true in Germany too, in a slightly different way, but I really think you can't start acting without your own big idea. So they have a big idea. And since I'm on the stage, I'm going to tell you how it goes. It goes like this. Freedom means that people who currently have power and wealth should have more, and everyone else should suffer, and they should enjoy suffering. Okay.
So what's our alternate version?
Right, exactly. So, and their very idea. I'm going to continue to be fair. Their idea is coherent because what they say is freedom is about your impulses. It's about how you feel right now. And I'm going to make you more free by delivering algorithmically more impulses to you. And I want you to bond with that screen. I want you to feel things very hard. I want you to hate people. And that's going to be freedom for you. Freedom for me is going to be, of course, drawing the hundreds of billions of dollars of profits from your emotional states. But freedom for you is going to be those emotional states. And freedom is coherent for them because it's about impulses and emotions. It's not about values. Not about values. And freedom is coherent for them because they say the government is always the problem. And that's a very simple statement, right? It's very elegant. It's very persuasive to a lot of people. Government's always the problem. And so then the solution in politics is always make the government smaller. And that's very coherent. They have a coherent story. The way the story works emotionally is that people who believe that freedom is that way become more and more predictable, less and less free, but they talk about freedom an awful lot, as you might have noticed from American culture, right? And talking about freedom a lot isn't necessarily a good side. So I think the only way you can win is to have a big, true story yourself. I think it's very hard to resist just by saying, this is bad here, and this is bad over there, and this is a mistake, and this is bad. And when I notice, again, countries vary, but when you look at American forms of opposition and resistance, it's a bit like that. It's like, that's intolerable, that's not acceptable, we're going to protest this. But I think it really helps if you if you have your own big story, which it not only embraces all of politics, but which is in some sense true, and which is not only in some sense, I think it's quite true, and which is actionable. So if when they say let freedom ring, what they mean is let us pick your pocket, and then tomorrow you're going to tell us that you loved it, right? That's what they mean by let freedom ring. You can do better than that with freedom, right? We can say freedom is actually about being good people. Yeah. Freedom involves being good. It doesn't involve being evil. Freedom involves people having more capabilities, right?
And who could develop and like distribute and push that counter narrative?
Yeah, hold on. There's one more thing I want to say about this before I answer that. Freedom can involve feeling good and not feeling bad. Like if you look at again, I'm taking America. 10 years ago, I would have taken Russian as my example. And I would have said, look at Putin. Does he really seem like a happy person, right? But now look at Trump. You know, is he happy? Is Musk happy? They get on the stage, they hog the stage, and they whine. Are they happy? I think I know a lot of people with a lot less money and power who are in fact freer and happier. And this is really important. I think if you think of freedom positively, you end up living a happier life because you end up listening to other people, you end up believing that some things are good, right? You end up having a better, happier, more free life if you think about freedom this way. And they're heroes of negative freedom, although they may be very wealthy and powerful, do not seem to be happy. They seem to be taking a lot of drugs. They seem to be ill, and they seem to be angry all the time, right? Okay, so
we have this, maybe we take this
I thought you were going to say, in Germany we have these libel laws, which I'm now going to explain to you.
Probably we take this as a common endeavor to develop that and to try that positive notion of freedom. So your interventions globally, your interventions in several countries are quite powerful. And you wrote on Germany a couple of weeks ago, and I want to just confront you with that and how that might be changed. So a couple of weeks ago, you wrote a piece for Welt am Sonntag, and which was kind of blissfully encouraging the role of Germany. So you said, quote, als wichtigste Demokratie in Europa und vielleicht nach dem Amtsantritt von Donald Trump in der Welt ist Deutschland der zentrale Ort des Widerstands. You mentioned resistance a couple of minutes ago. Wenn die Deutschen die Bedrohung nicht verstehen, haben wir keine andere Chance.
Ja,
Zitat Ende.
Ja,
do the Germans understand the threat?
Ich sage das auf einem gewissen Grund, nämlich in Deutschland sagt man immer, naja, also die Amerikaner sind wichtiger als wir. Und ich habe gemerkt, wie 8 oder 9 Jahre her, ich habe auch gemacht, okay, ab jetzt ist Deutschland die wichtige Demokratie. Ja. Und die Deutschen haben immer gesagt, nein, das kann nicht so sein, wir wollen das gar nicht. Ja. Also ich probiere nochmal. Und ich sage nicht, dass alles hier am besten ginge. Na, es geht nicht darum. Aber es ist der Fall, sozusagen objektiv, dass jetzt Deutschland die wichtigste Demokratie auf der Erde ist. Ob man das will oder nicht. So ist das.
Und glauben Sie, dass wir verstanden haben oder verstanden könnten, dass Deutschland die wichtigste Demokratie ist? Und zweitens, würden wir dann auch verstehen, wie groß die Bedrohung ist?
Also ich fürchte mich immer, dass wenn ich Deutsch spreche, lächelt man. Und dann habe ich gemerkt, dass das stimmt. Okay.
Aber wir nehmen das als Anlass gleich, dass Sie auf Deutsch Ihre Fragen stellen können. Aber die Antwort will ich gerne noch hören.
Also insofern ich Deutsch spreche, bin ich frei. Weil man nur frei ist, wenn man Fähigkeiten hat. Nein, ich würde nicht sagen, dass man das verstünde in Deutschland, nein. Und dass man die Drohungen versteht, also ja und nein. Ich würde sagen, das Niveau der Diskussion ist hier eben sehr hoch, doch, aber man ist vielleicht nicht so konkret, wie man es wünschen könnte. Zum Beispiel im Sachbereich Russland ich hätte mir gewünscht, dass die Diskussion viel konkreter, viel schneller wäre, als es gewesen war.
Vielen Dank, Timothy Snyder. Bis hierher. Wir haben die Gelegenheit für einige Fragen von Ihnen, wenn Sie mögen. Ich habe auch noch 1700 weitere, die ich gern stellte. Aber wenn Sie eine Frage stellen mögen, wir haben Mikrofone dort, vielleicht stellen Sie sich kurz vor, fassen sich kurz und beenden Ihre Frage mit einem Fragezeichen. Ich glaube, Fritz Breithaupt war der Erste hier in der 5. Reihe.
Thank you very much. I want to push the point here a little bit about...
Maybe you just introduce yourself like briefly.
Well, you already said my name. Who am I? I mean, you said it all. Fritz Breithaupt. I am a researcher of storytelling and intellectual history. But I want to question the appeal of this notion of negative freedom. And I wonder whether that has to do with the narratives. Manuel Hartung mentioned the narratives that go along with negative freedom, the one against everyone, the hero, the triumph, and so on and so on. Yeah. And I wonder whether that appeal of the negative freedom notion often not is just beating the narratives and stories that you are pushing for, rightfully so, on the positive side. And of course, I want to push back very briefly also on the notion of the negativity of Donald Trump. I think
the what?
The negativity of the emotions of Donald Trump and Elon Musk. I think for the followers, there's a lot of positive emotions. There's the triumph, there is the defense of their own country, the warm feeling of satisfaction of punishing others, and so on and so on. So I don't think it's just all negative. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll start with the second part. I agree with you. A lot of pleasure is taken in punishing others. I'm not sure that's what I meant by happiness, though. So I didn't claim that there was no emotion or enjoyment or pleasure. There is, and in the book, and in some other writings, I developed this notion of pseudo-populism, where rather than imagining a liberal form of politics in which all of us can do a little bit better, you imagine a form of politics without a future in which some of us enjoy hurting others, and where the leader in the political system is the one, not to paraphrase Schmidt a little bit, but the leader is the one who decides who punishes whom, who gets to have the pleasure of punishing whom. And I think there's a lot of that. I mean, I'm agreeing with you. I think there's a lot of that in Trump's charisma. And he is charismatic. He's quite intelligent. He's very effective. It makes no sense to underestimate the man. He's very good at instructing people that politics is a kind of negative-sum game, and you should be happy because you're going to suffer, but you're going to suffer less than those black people. You're going to suffer less than the migrants, right? So consider deportation actions now. Are the Trump people deporting more than the Biden people did? No, not yet anyway. No, just in numbers, like they haven't gotten the number. Maybe they will, but basically they're just deporting at the same rate. The president who deported the most people was Barack Obama, actually. So, but they haven't changed the numbers. Maybe they will. But what they've changed is they put the cameras on it. They show people being deported, and then the media covers it, and then the people who aren't deported can enjoy it in a certain kind of way. So I agree with that. It's just those emotions, I think, are not liberating, because I think what is liberating is the ability to move on a register of a whole lot of positive values rather than being stuck between anxiety and relief, anxiety and relief, anxiety and relief. And I think that politics of hurting people is about anxiety and relief, like the thrill of it's not me, which depends on the possibility that it could be you, right? So that's definitely a form of pleasure, I agree. It's not what I had in mind with happiness. And with narratives, I also think you have a terrific point. I think that's absolutely right. And I write about that, and I sometimes dwell on it too. The narrative of Hollywood movies, I think, is very compelling here, where the threat comes from the outside, and everything, like the way the plot works, like you're in everyday life and like everything's going okay, and like you're an everyday person, and like maybe you've got a problem with your girlfriend, but like basically everything's okay, and then the monster comes out of the sky, right? And then you get in your pickup truck and you slay it with your lightsaber, or whatever, right? But then the story is over. And that's the thing, like it's the lone, the problem was negative, the problem was a threat from the outside, and the problem is resolved by a lone hero. And that narrative, of course, is very powerful, as you say. And I think that narrative, I think there's a kind of reinforcement though, because I think the narrative and the economy kind of work together as well. That if we're trying to teach you that freedom means being all by yourself, then this is the kind of story you end up, which ends up seeming like good taste or acceptable. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about Hollywood movies because there's some interesting exceptions too, but that is one narrative. Here's another narrative which is very powerful, even though it's crazy. The narrative of the free market as such. If I say free market, probably even among the good liberals here, the free market will seem like something good or positive, or at least exists in the world. But it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as the free market. You can only have a market with property rights, and property rights are par excellence what we would call a government intervention in the economy, right? You cannot have a market without property rights. Property rights requires a government. And once you recognize that, it's just a question of what kind of government you want. But the free market narrative says, it's the government's always the problem. Let's knock down the government. And then that has clear effects for freedom, but it's a very powerful story because it always gives you a recommendation for policy. Let's always make the government smaller. So I agree with that, and that's one of the reasons why I mean, like, you know, the reviewers in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung can tell me whether I succeeded, but this is one reason why I tried really hard with the narrative in this book. It's why I wrote it as like 90 vignettes instead of just propositions, because I take your basic point, like storytelling isn't the same thing as truth, but storytelling is also part of what's human. And if you can't, and truth is truth and storytelling is storytelling, but it's worth the effort to try to tell your truth in stories.
So it's good actually to start with demasking some of the narratives. So we have a couple of more hands up, actually. We tried brief questions and a couple of brief answers. So Silvia Stöber was probably next over here in the third row.
Vielen Dank. Mein Name ist Silvia Stöber, ich bin Journalistin, arbeite für die Tagesschau und ich möchte fortfahren mit den Narrativen und eines, das auch sehr stark zu sein scheint in den USA, dass man Grenzen verschieben will, also das, was in der Identität der Amerikaner sehr tief verwurzelt ist und wo wir jetzt im Moment aktuell von Mexiko sprechen, von Grönland und so weiter, aber darüber hinaus ja auch schon sehr lange darüber geredet wird, dass man den Weltraum erobern will, dass man Altersgrenzen verschieben will, dass man gesund für immer sein möchte. Und das scheint mir doch ein sehr, sehr starkes Narrativ zu sein, was sehr compelling, also sehr, sehr attraktiv ist für die Menschen. Und das ist nicht so einfach zu überwinden.
Shall we clip some more and maybe round it up at the end? Is that fine?
Okay.
Or would you love to answer?
Well, why don't we take one or two more, because there might be
so
some
maybe
overlap.
Klaus Mielke over here.
Ja, Klaus Mielke von der Stiftung Zukunftsfähigkeit. Und das passt ganz gut zu Ihrer Frage. Freiheit und planetare Grenzen. Klimakrise. Die Freiheit des Menschen hat dazu geführt, dass wir jetzt aus dem Holozän heraustreten in das Anthropozän und dass eigentlich die Menschen für sich als Gemeinschaft kaum noch eine Zukunft haben. Also Freiheit wird begrenzt durch das Tun der Menschen. Wie würden Sie das einordnen bei dem, was Sie als anzustrebende Freiheit bezeichnen?
Vielen herzlichen Dank. Nehmen wir noch eine dazu. Da oben war noch eine Hand hier vorne, glaube ich. Ja. Oder erstmal da und dann.
You were talking about the social media algorithms. It seemed like as a...
Would you love to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Alex Atoma, just an interested reader and follower of your writings. You were talking about the social media algorithms it seems as quite an existential threat to your concept of freedom. I was just wondering, how would you advise policymakers at a European level, if you were asked, in a way, how to deal with that problem, in a way that wouldn't be counterproductive to the propaganda efforts of the likes of Elon Musk and the tech oligarchs?
All right, so 3 big ones. We try to condense that. What's your take
so
on this?
I'm going to start with the last one and then try to deal with these two a little bit together. I'm glad you used the word existential. I honestly think it's not just existential for my concept of freedom. I think it's existential for us, quite literally. The screens are a threat which can bring us down. I mean, they can make us stupid to the point that we can't address the actual problems in the actual 3-dimensional world. And climate change is a very good example. People are stupider about climate change than they used to be, at least in the English-speaking world, and that's for a reason. It's because the algorithms promote fiction about climate change, and that's been very sad to watch, right? And it, for me, calls into question whether we should regard social media as technology or not. I'm moving myself towards the view that we should be thinking about it in anthropological rather than technological terms. We should be thinking about it in terms of what kind of human relationship we have to it. I feel that calling it technology, or especially high technology, is actually propaganda, that it's not really high technology. I don't like to treat Facebook or Twitter as high technology, strikes me as just basically a mistake. It's very simple behaviorist algorithms which work very quickly. But I think it's not nearly as technologically impressive as an automobile, honestly. And I think the fact that we think of it as technologically impressive is a bad sign about who's winning this contest between the algorithms and the human mind. I think we all kind of take for granted that it's high technology, and I really don't think it is, and interestingly, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg thinks it's high technology either. I think he knows better. I mean, I think he knows it's just basically some simple code that he wrote 30 years ago, And I think they know that. They know it's best understood. I'm getting to this question. It's basically, they know it's best understood in anthropological terms. And the reason we know they know that is because they send their kids to schools where there are no screens. Pretty much all of them send their kids to schools with no screens because they know that it's best understood not as some fantastic empowering thing, but it's better understood as a kind of addictive product or designed to be addictive. And that leads to the answer to the question. I mean, I think it's incredibly important to answer the Kato Kavo question, whom. I think if screens are in classrooms, it should only be to teach kids how to program. I really don't think they should be there for any other purpose. I think they should not be in classrooms. And I worry in countries like Germany where, the attitude is, okay, we were analog for a very long time and now we have to be digital, so let's do the worst possible things, in order to catch up to the things that have destroyed America, let's do the same things they did. But I really don't think that you should bring screens into classrooms. I think that's a terrible mistake. I think the classroom ought to be a space where children are allowed to be children and their minds are allowed to develop along with other human minds, even though it's more work. I think that's one thing one can definitely do. One can regulate social media. One can subsidize investigative journalism. You have to subsidize it. So those are the basic things. Regulate, keep the screens out of classrooms, and encourage the alternatives. I'm going to group these questions a little bit. I got to start by saying I think that negative freedom, in the premise of your question, I wouldn't say freedom, I would say negative freedom, because in my notion of, so I actually take the idea of freedom and bodily recognition rather far. For those who go into the book, I try very hard to get us to empathize with the with the microscopic creatures which were killed 800 million years ago so that we can burn them as fossil fuels. And I'm kind of serious because I think it is actually a strange thing about us that when we burn the hydrocarbons, we don't think of the life on the other side. And there was life on the other side. We're burning life when we burn fossil fuels. That's why they're called fossil fuels. And I was joking a bit about the empathy, that's a lot to ask, but if we think about it that way, if we recognize that what we've done is we've gone back into Earth's record of previous life, dug it up and burned it, then we're in a different kind of relationship with the process, one in which I think we can be more realistic, right? So I don't think freedom has created the Anthropocene. Most people during the Anthropocene, by the way, have not been free. I think that an idea of negative freedom, like the idea which says, let's go dig up Greenland, I think that idea has made us less free. And I think we can only be free insofar as we recognize what our bodies actually need in the world, which means an attitude of recognition towards the world. And so what's happening with Trump and Musk is something which I would call a politics of catastrophe, where they're actually pro-global warming because global warming creates the catastrophes which they then use to target people. So, of course, there's going to be more south to north migration when there's more global warming, and they don't mind south to north migration. Musk employs people illegally. We will never actually throw them all out because the oligarchs employ them. So, you may still have a party in Germany which sincerely wants to throw people out, but don't worry, when Musk is in charge, that will change. Just give him some time. So there's a politics of catastrophe which depends upon, rather than addressing the basic problems for all of us, blaming the victims, which in the United States are migrants who come from south to north.
Timothy Snyder, es ist eine wahnsinnig intensive Diskussion. Man hört hier quasi jede Stecknadel fallen in diesem Raum. Und ich habe, glaube ich, zwei gute Nachrichten für alle in diesem Raum. Ich habe noch 15 Fragen. Ich habe noch
das war keine gute Nachricht.
Ich habe 15 Hände noch oben gesehen.
Oh, okay.
Und wir werden alle diese Fragen beantworten. Aber wir tun das, und das ist die zweite Nachricht, zum einen bei einem Glas Wein und zum anderen inspiriert von Ideengebenden, die Lösungen anbieten für genau die großen Herausforderungen, die Sie geschildert haben. In der Bildung beispielsweise. Wie geht das, was Sie gesagt haben, ja, in den Schulen? Bei der Frage, wie geht Zusammenleben beispielsweise in Ostdeutschland? Und ich werde gleich eine Reihe von Initiatoren einmal noch auf die Bühne bitten und mit denen kurz einmal darüber sprechen, was kann das sein? Was können wir ganz konkret mitnehmen an diesen Dingen? Und wenn man einen Ratschlag aus einem vorherigen Buch von Ihnen mitnehmen kann, einem Bestseller, der Millionen inspiriert hat tatsächlich, nämlich die 20 Lektionen gegen die Tyrannei, da lautet der 20. Ratschlag: Be as courageous as you can. Man soll so mutig sein, wie man nur kann. An dieser Hochschule steht, die meisten wissen, da steht auf dem Campus ein großes Kunstwerk mit dem Schriftzug Mut. Und ich glaube, an einem solchen Tag wie diesem, wo Sie uns Analysen gegeben haben, die so glasklar sind. Sie haben uns Analysen gegeben, die genau den Weg aufgezeigt haben, wie es gelingen kann, vielleicht ein überwölbendes negatives Narrativ in ein anderes Narrativ zu verwandeln und wie man trotz der dramatischen Situation weltweit vielleicht ein kleines bisschen Hoffnung behalten kann. Da arbeiten wir hoffentlich gemeinsam an diesen Lösungen. Ich möchte mich ganz, ganz, ganz herzlich im Namen von uns allen bei Ihnen bedanken, Timothy Snyder. Das war eine ganz wunderbare Lecture und ich darf Ihnen noch einen kleinen Gruß überreichen. Einen kleinen Gruß der Stiftung, den Sie hoffentlich mit nach Hause nehmen können. Das ist nicht nur ein Tote Bag, sondern ein Hoodie. Aha, okay. Und ich glaube in Violett, es ist eine optimistische Farbe, das wird Sie hoffentlich begleiten. Ich bin froh und glücklich über diese Lecture. Schön, dass Sie heute bei uns waren. Einen großen Applaus für Timothy Snyder.
Danke. Vielen, vielen Dank.
Und bevor wir die Gelegenheit haben, das gemeinsam zu vertiefen, möchte ich genau diese Impulse für das, was man wirklich tun kann, einmal hier noch gemeinschaftlich thematisieren. Wir haben aus allen Bereichen der Stiftung, denn es fungiert ja auch als ein programmatischer Jahresauftakt. Ja? Also nicht die Frage, wie können wir die Gedanken der positiven Freiheit auch in die einzelnen Themenfelder der Stiftung mit einführen, haben wir aus jedem Bereich eine Initiative gebeten, sich hier einmal kurz vorzustellen. Nicht nur kurz hier oben mit einer Frage, sondern auch unten mit Tischen, wo Sie gemeinschaftlich miteinander ins Gespräch kommen können. Und ich darf nun als erstes Lara Dell'Andrea und Alissa Uruguele hier zu mir auf die Bühne bitten. Schön, dass Sie da sind. Ich mache das ruhig. Ich nehme Ihnen das gerne ab. Sie stehen für ein Programm der Stiftung Gemeinsam wachsen, wo wir aufgrund der großen Herausforderungen, die es in Schulen gibt, gesagt haben, wir setzen ein Programm auf mit Workshops gegen Rassismus, Sexismus, Antisemitismus, versuchen da zu sensibilisieren. Das ist im April 2024 gestartet. 600 Schülerinnen sind schon durch die Programme gelaufen an den einzelnen Schulen. Sie sind einer der Projektpartner, das Institut für konstruktive Konfliktaustragung und Mediation. Und ganz kurz, was machen Sie in den Schulen genau? Ich kann das auch halten, wenn Sie mögen. Ja?
Also wir bieten unterschiedliche Formate an, von eintägig bis zu viertägig, wo wir über und mit unseren Schwerpunkten arbeiten, Diversitätssensibilität und auch Konfliktaustragung. Außerdem bieten wir noch unterschiedliche Formate an. Eins davon heißt Lebensrealität Rassismus. Da geht es darum, über Rassismus zu sprechen, Definitionen auszuarbeiten und auch Betroffene zu stärken und Nicht-Betroffene zu sensibilisieren. Und dazu haben wir auch viele Einblicke und Eindrücke heute mitgebracht, unten auf unseren Stehtischen und freuen uns auf eure Gesichter. Genau.
Großartig, vielen Dank. Ich frage Sie noch mal, was verändern denn die Workshops bei den Kindern eigentlich genau? Also wie anders gehen die raus, als sie reingegangen sind?
Ja, das ist natürlich eine gute Frage, die wir uns auch in der Konzeption und der Weiterentwicklung von unseren Formaten immer wieder fragen. Und Ziel ist es natürlich, sie zu stärken und einerseits zu stärken, dabei konstruktiv Konflikte auszutragen. Das heißt, eigene Interessen zu erkennen, sie zu artikulieren und sie auch verhandeln zu können. Ich glaube, das ist ein ganz großer Teil. Das Ganze natürlich in einer sehr vielfältigen Welt, das heißt eingebettet in Machtstrukturen, in Diskriminierung. Genau, sie dahin zu stärken. Und das andere ist natürlich auch Lehrkräfte vielleicht ein wenig darin zu stärken, wie sie ihre Klasse gut begleiten können miteinander.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank für Ihre wertvolle Arbeit und ich bin mir sicher, dass unten am Tisch es gleich genug Möglichkeiten für weitere Kooperationen, Ideen und Austausch gibt. Schön, dass Sie bei uns sind. Ich darf jetzt Olaf Ebert und Clara Hagedorn von der Stiftung Bürger für Bürger aus Halle zu uns bitten. Schön, dass ihr da seid. Ihr steht für die Initiative Zukunftswege Ost, eine Initiative, die die Zeitstiftung gemeinsam mit anderen Stiftungen initiiert hat, um genau konkret zu fragen, was hilft der Zivilgesellschaft in Ostdeutschland, vernetzen verschiedene Akteure. Es gibt auch einen großen Fonds, wo kleine Initiativen sich bewerben können. Frage an Clara Hagedorn, 100 Initiativen wurden schon gefördert mit kleinen Beträgen. Was ist denn so ein Beispiel für so etwas?
Ja, wir erreichen eine ganze Bandbreite an Organisationen, also wirklich von der Freiwilligen Feuerwehr, dem Heimatverein, Sportverein und ja, das spiegelt sich auch in der Themenvielfalt wieder von diesen über 100 Projekten. Um ein Beispiel vielleicht zu nennen, aus Sachsen, ein alter, ausrangierter Bus wird umgebaut für 5.000 € von Jugendlichen und ja, ein sicherer Begegnungsraum entsteht abseits ja, von einseitiger politischer Beeinflussung. Wir haben viele weitere Projektbeispiele dabei und freuen uns auch auf ganz viel Austausch nachher.
Großartig, dann frage ich aber Olaf Ebert einmal nochmal, was bewirkt das denn eigentlich? Also wenn wir auf die Lage im Osten schauen, das Zukunftswege-Narrativ, wir hatten es von positiven Geschichten eben schon mit Timothy Snyder, was bewirkt Zukunftswege Ost?
Ja, wir sehen eben in Ostdeutschland viele Menschen, die etwas vor Ort tun wollen. Oft liegt aber der Fokus eher auf den negativen, polarisierenden Erfahrungen und Konfrontationen, Anfeindungen. Und mit Zukunftswege Ost können wir eben Menschen aktivieren, vor Ort etwas für das Zusammenleben zu tun und mit kleinen Mitteln bis zu 5.000 € ganz viel Dialog, Austausch, Begegnung und eben ja, Selbstwirksamkeit Gemeinsamkeitserfahrungen schaffen. Ich kann vor Ort etwas bewegen für ein gutes Zusammenleben und dafür braucht es eben auch private Mittel, weil eben hier auch in Ostdeutschland viel zu wenig private Mittel vorhanden sind, um das gesellschaftliche Miteinander zu unterstützen.
Vielen herzlichen Dank auch dafür die wertvolle Arbeit. Die Zeitstiftung Bucerius hat im vergangenen November ein Demokratiepaket von 1 Million Euro geschnürt, wo sehr viel Mittel auch an zukünftige Ost gegangen sind. Eine ganze Reihe von anderen Stiftungen und Förderern sind dabei. Weitere können hinzukommen, alle gleich bei euch beim Tisch melden. Ich darf jetzt Katrin Jäger von Tide einmal zu mir auf die Bühne bitten. Katrin Jäger, Sie stehen für das Projekt Gemeinsam aushandeln. Das setzt Journalismus im Stadtteil ein. Tide ist ja ein Sender, der in Hamburg aktiv ist. Und gestern haben wir hier mit Bernhard Pörksen unter anderem über die redaktionelle Gesellschaft und das gute Zuhören gesprochen. Und Sie bieten dort ja Dialogveranstaltungen an, ehrenamtliche Stadtteilredaktionen. Ja, was können denn Bürgerinnen und Bürger überhaupt machen bei einem Fernsehsender, bei einem solchen Projekt?
Alles.
Vielen Dank. Etwas ausführlicher gerne.
Ja, also Sie können Ihren eigenen Beitrag machen, sowohl im Radio als auch im TV. Sie können vor und hinter der Kamera stehen, Sie können moderieren, Sie können Ihren eigenen Beitrag konzipieren, Ihre eigene Sendung, Podcast konzipieren, whatever. Und wir begleiten Sie dabei, wir coachen Sie dort hinein, wenn Sie das wünschen. Also insofern, die Bandbreite ist wirklich groß.
Und nehmen Sie jetzt den Impuls von Timothy Snyder, wie wichtig Journalismus ist und warum man ihn braucht und warum es wahr und nicht wahr gibt. Nehmen Sie das mit in Ihre Arbeit?
Absolut. Und auch wenn Sie Bernhard Pörksen nennen, das ist ein Credo unserer Arbeit, die redaktionelle Gesellschaft. Denn uns ist es ganz wichtig, dass die Menschen gerade hinsichtlich des Schwunds des Lokaljournalismus selbst aktiv werden und auch demokratisch teilhaben, indem sie selbst eben journalistische Beiträge produzieren und insofern auch selbst wirksam werden. Und das ist ganz, ganz wichtig.
Vielen herzlichen Dank auch für die wertvolle Arbeit. Und auch viele Vernetzungsideen zur Frage, wie man Journalismus in Zukunft retten, anders gestalten, unterstützen kann, freuen Sie sich auch unten bei Ihrem Tisch. Jetzt darf ich noch Martina Malknecht und Martin Prinoth vom Künstlerkollektiv Tosu zu mir auf die Bühne bitten. Herzlich willkommen. Und Sie beide gehören dem ersten Jahrgang unseres Stipendiums für darstellende Künste. Das haben wir in diesem Jahr zum ersten Mal gemacht an. Es gab ein Thema für dieses Stipendium und das war, ich weiß nicht, ob es überrascht an diesem Abend, Freiheit. Und das Projekt soll dazu dienen, künstlerische Forschung, transdisziplinäre Ansätze zu fördern. Der Name Tosu, Ihr Künstlerkollektiv, der Name ist rätoromanisch. Ich spreche das nicht, aber ich habe mir sagen lassen, es heißt aufzeichnen und dokumentieren. Und ich wollte Sie einmal fragen, im Mai gibt es eine Premiere auf Kampnagel Ihres neuen Projektes O Europa. Was erwartet einen da? O Europa.
Genau, die Premiere wird sein am 7. Mai, um gleich ein bisschen Werbung zu machen. Und da freuen wir uns natürlich, wenn wir Gesichter von heute Abend wiedersehen. Genau, in dem Projekt, das wird ein multimediales Theaterstück sein. Und das Spezielle an unseren Projekten ist, dass wir immer mit Expertinnen aus dem Lebensalltag zusammenarbeiten. Das sind in diesem Fall Menschen mit Fluchterfahrung an den europäischen Außengrenzen. Und genau, das Projekt wird eine Perspektive aus der anderen Richtung sozusagen über den Weg nach Europa genau zeigen. Da freuen wir uns.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank. Ich bin gespannt, mehr zu erfahren. Und Martin Prinoth, weil wir jetzt so am Ende stehen, darf ich einmal fragen, was bedeutet denn eigentlich Freiheit für Sie so persönlich?
Wow. Darf ich hier den Abend damit abrunden und abschließen? Das finde ich...
Also wenn Sie 15 Fragen Zeit hätten, hätte ich noch.
Also was... vielleicht Freiheit auch in der Kunst oder Freiheit im Arbeiten, im künstlerischen Arbeiten. Ich glaube, was ich heute gelernt habe, ist, dass es keine freie Gesellschaft gibt, wenn nicht alle Bereiche frei sind. Und ich glaube, in der Kunst ist diese Freiheit, vielleicht wird sie dort am sichtbarsten oder auch oft am erlebbarsten. Und ohne diese Freiheit könnte Kunst aus meiner Sicht absolut nicht existieren. Dafür möchte ich nochmal jetzt die Gelegenheit nutzen, auch die Zeitstiftung Bucerius zu bedanken, denn damit bekommen wir natürlich auch im Moment Freiheit im Finanziellen, aber auch uns Zeit zu nehmen, marginalisierte Gruppen ins Zentrum zu holen, auf die Bühne zu holen und mit einem Publikum zu teilen. Und ich glaube, das ist eine sehr große Freiheit, die wir uns da nehmen wollen und auch nehmen werden.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank. Ich glaube, ich nehme den Dank stellvertretend für meine vielen Kolleginnen und Kollegen, die hier im Raum sind, natürlich gerne an. Ich will aber sagen, das ist auch die Aufgabe einer Stiftung. Wir haben uns als Ziele gesetzt, Freiheiten zu verteidigen, Freiräume zu schaffen, also auch Freiräume für Künstlerinnen und Künstler zu geben und Orientierung zu geben. Und ich glaube, heute an diesem Abend haben wir diese 3 Ansätze fast mustergültig miteinander verbunden. Freiheiten verteidigen, Freiräume zu schaffen und Orientierung zu geben. Und dafür bin ich sehr dankbar, dafür bin ich Ihnen sehr dankbar. Ich freue mich sehr auf die gemeinsame Diskussion, die wir jetzt ein Stockwerk tiefer noch haben können, an Ihren Thementischen, beziehungsweise untereinander mit Ihnen. Ich will aber diesen Abend, diesen Teil hier oben nicht beschließen, ohne noch einmal sehr Danke zu sagen. Danke zu sagen bei Timothy Snyder. Ich möchte auch Danke sagen bei Manfred Lahnstein für die Einführung. Ich möchte Dank sagen an Jonathan Beck, Sebastian Ulrich und Katrin Dähn vom Beck Verlag, die auch hier unter uns sind, die uns hierbei unterstützt haben. Ich möchte Danke sagen an Rebecca Tiedemann und die Bucerius Event, die vieles organisatorisch hier aufgesetzt hat. Und ich möchte ein ganz besonders großes Dankeschön nochmal sagen an das Team Wissenschaft und Forschung der Zeitstiftung Bucerius, die das hier entsprechend organisiert haben. Vielleicht stehen die Kollegen, die seit Monaten hier für diesen Abend arbeiten, einmal kurz auf. Das sind Anna Hofmann, Rosenka Babinitz, Christine Böke, Marc Rieger und aus der Kommunikation Dorit Schartau und Robin Micha. Einen großen Applaus. Und dann darf ich schließen mit dem Satz, der die 20. Lektion von Timothy Snyders Buch ist über Tyrannei. Seien wir so mutig, wie wir nur sein können. Vielen herzlichen Dank und einen schönen Abend.